Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conceptualism. I'm very pleased today to have with me the director and CEO of the Aga Khan Museum, Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis. Welcome to the show, Dr. Al-Khamis, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Your tenure at the museum has seen some very interesting things happen. I know that the pandemic has been difficult for many institutions, but evidently, the Aga Khan Museum has responded profoundly and profusely by making content that's beautiful and inspiring. So thank you for stewarding the ship in the right direction.
I'm delighted that you think so. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And the impact and relevance of the museum has skyrocketed since the pandemic. So because more and more people are accessing museums content through the internet, through the digital archives. And this is important in order to be an international institution. And obviously, you guys are doing it and doing it beautifully. So I'm very moved by how the museum has responded to the difficulty of the pandemic.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Dr. Al-Khamis, I wanted to start today by asking you about the role of polymath and polymathic thinking in Islam, of the great scholars, of the great thinkers that have shaped Muslim civilizations.
Yes, and that is a very important and interesting topic, because it is actually a mindset that we need to get back to in our day and age, where ever more dissecting academic specializations lose sometimes the big picture, the comprehensive picture, the universalist picture when looking at themes or issues that we are all grappling with today.
No, I would concur completely with you on that assessment. And it's difficult to really comprehend just how vast the gaps are when you start to look at something very narrowly. So people that are able to look at the whole picture, as you say, the big picture, are able to make contributions that a specialist may fail to make, not because they're not capable or qualified, but really because they just don't see it.
Yeah, and also when you go back to the meaning of the word polymath, which comes from the Greek polymathes, it stands for a human being that is constantly learning, that is learning very much across disciplines, and ultimately also comes close to the concept of a universal human. So a human being that has an understanding of how the human condition actually interconnects with all the manifestations of the universe, across time and space and across disciplines. And this is a mindset that presupposes someone with constant curiosity, infinite desire to learn, to discover, to explore, to acknowledge ignorance, and joyfully moving on from that ignorance towards greater understanding of things, concepts, perceptions that differ from the point where the inquiry starts.
That's a very important place to start, is at that vanguard, as you say. And I love that Einstein famously said that knowledge is limited, but imagination is limitless, because that threshold between what you know and what there is to know is so, well, infinite, really. And great philosophers have always said that the most learned people are constantly observing the ontological limits of their knowledge so that they can continue to expand that threshold, let's say, to push that envelope, if you will. Well, as an artist myself who works on the vanguard, I can tell you it's not always easy to be on the vanguard. They say the leading edge is the bleeding edge, and it's not always easy to go beyond. not simply because the knowledge itself is difficult to attain, but also because reception sometimes is not guaranteed, and an artist or a scholar may even become a social pariah, for example. As well, there are famous cases, Galileo and many other thinkers who were persecuted for their views and for the questions that they dared to ask of the institutions of their day and age. So for an institution to actually be questioning itself as well, I think is a very important epistemological centering. And I feel like the Aga Khan Museum does that on some level, and that's very difficult for a whole institution to do. So it's heartening to see that you're always, the institution itself, and as well as the people who work in it, are constantly re-examining, re-questioning, recontextualizing not just the permanent collection, but even the temporary exhibitions, the performance works, even the space itself, right? Like, I've heard so many interpretation of what the building, the Aga Khan Museum itself is. Like Professor Maki, for example, probably had one vision, and every single person that interacts with that building has their interpretation. And I think that's beautiful, because even the building itself lends itself to an open questioning, a critical examination, a critical intersection and interaction. And I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, and when you, coming back to the polymath concept, it is a journey. It is not ever something where you reach a destination, because the very definition encapsulates the continuum in terms of searching for knowledge, searching for enlightenment, which is of course something that the architecture very much represents as well, the coming together of light in the physical and in the spiritual sense on the one hand, and then also human enlightenment through knowing each other better and searching for knowledge beyond what is familiar and beyond what is comfortable. And within the context of Islam, of course, seeking knowledge is actually one of the requirements of someone who submits to the will of God, i.e., a Muslim, because that is what that term stands for, a human being that submits to the will of God. And from the very outset, knowledge and scientific knowledge really lies at the heart of being a full human being, a full believer, and a full contributor to the world that we find ourselves in at any one point in time. And that is also what has always, up to this day and age, characterized the polymath scientists, scholars that we still know today, and that through a Western-centric lens always kind of associated with one exclusive specific specialism, but who in fact in their lifetimes and even within the context of Muslim civilizations at large were so much more than that and were acknowledged as so much more than that. So if you had somebody famous like Ibn Sina, who later became known as Avicenna in the West, he is celebrated today as a medical genius, but he was actually someone who was an astronomer, an alchemist, a geographer. He dabbled in psychology, he wrote poetry, and of course he also was a faithful Muslim. So the tendency to dissect an individual's intellectual preoccupations is actually something that can be connected to a Western way of academia, a Western way of creating taxonomies and systems of definition, of specialization. And the challenge with that view is that you are losing sight of a whole person, a whole unilateral worldview, a kaleidoscopic potential of seeing the world. And it is something that you also still see in the Renaissance period, when, of course, many of the scholars that are still familiar in Western perception today, like Leonardo da Vinci, also imbibed. So we know Leonardo da Vinci today as a phenomenal artist and painter of the Mona Lisa, but he was in fact an engineer. He was a scientist, a scholar, an inventor.
Even a musician.
Yes, absolutely, because those polymaths, whether they lived in the East or in the West, still understood the inherent interconnectivity of intangible and tangible arts and harmonies and balances and geometries and patterns and rhythms and mathematical principles, because they underlie everything.
Absolutely. I mean, I wrote a tiny little phrase that, you know, truth and the universe are encoded in vibrations, and that you know, the ability to see into something, whatever your departure point is, wherever you start, you know, that interconnectedness of everything, that oneness, let's call it, which is of course a very Muslim principle, is seen because all the subjects, you know, all the worldviews, all the Weltanschauungs are actually trying to understand the truth, whether it's religion, philosophy, science, whatever. Everybody wants to know the truth. They want to know the reality. And I think polymaths understood that problem of the truth, when you started to understand from many perspectives, became clearer. There was more clarity in the way that you could see the problem. I also know, for example, that Brian Eno, as a famous British musician and polymath in his own right, said that when you are uncomfortable, that's really when art happens, because you're alert. If you're in your comfort zone, then it's very difficult because you repeat yourself, you repeat your habits. I think it's the same with any seeker of knowledge and of wisdom, hikmah, or truth. I wanted to also add that Al-Khwarizmi is one of my particular heroes, because not only was he the founding father of algebra, as you well know, and also algorithms, his name Latinized as algoritmi, but he was also a cartographer. And he discovered the circumference of the earth to a very accurate degree back in a time where you know, there was no tools. He had to imagine basically the construct and then create the experiment, or let's say to facilitate the team of cartographers who actually measured the distance. And I find that incredible because it shows the power of mind over matter, and how things like computation are actually founded in this very idea of polymathy and of logic and reason. As you say, Islam is a faith that is based in reason. So I think we are living histories in a sense of the pursuits of these great minds, because we couldn't have this call today without Al-Khwarizmi, you know.
Yes, this is very true. This is very true. But, you know, experiences like Al-Khwarizmi can teach us also about other phenomena that, again, are timeless, are universal, and could be observed today if only we probed into those realities a little bit more. Because Khwarizmi, who kind of lived from the 780s to the 850s, he was first of all Persian from Khwarazm, that's where his name came from. But then he also moved away from his homeland to take over the leadership of the library at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in Iraq. So
Beit al-Hikmah.
That's right. And, you know, you can imagine at that time how many hundreds and thousands of miles he would have had to transverse in order to get to his new home. And of course, nowadays, when we look at scientists and scholars, just like throughout history, they will always look, in a sense, to a center of patronage that gives them the opportunity and the scope to contribute. And often that means having to transverse countries, if not even continents. And
True.
It means transversing languages. It
Yes.
means transversing cultural differences and specificities and navigating and mitigating them. And in a globalized world today, and for us here in Toronto, for example, this is something that we all do every single day.
True.
What we also do, and what also characterized Khwarazmi and so many of his peers across the centuries, was the willingness to acknowledge and to immerse themselves and learn from and build on the wisdoms that came before them. So
Yes.
Khwarazmi, for example, was well aware of the Hellenistic legacies, in particular of ancient knowledge. And in his geographical work, for example, he went back to immersing himself in Ptolemy's work.
Yes.
So we never come and we never grow out of a vacuum. We always evolve on the basis of generations and scholars and wise men and women that came before us.
We are the product. We are the product of a certain milieu. As Brian Eno, and I love this guy because he had the courage to articulate a completely new word. Instead of saying people are geniuses, he says Cenius, and Cenius means essentially you come out of the scene. Nobody's a genius. No, they're the result of that entire scene, right? Like if you came into a vacuum, you would have nothing to do. The human mind can't work, right? We're social animals. So what you say about a scene is so important to acknowledge, right? Because we say Leonardo da Vinci was a great, genius, but if he didn't exist in a time where that was acceptable, that was fostered, that was cultivated, where that space was there for him to make those contributions, he could not have come to be. So what you say is so important. And Prince Amin actually said, we are where we come from, famously. He says that adds so much depth to artistic and intellectual endeavoring today, because if we forget where we've come from, then, someone says, oh, well, if you really want to do something new, you have to forget everything that's happened. Well, no, that doesn't make any sense. You have to know everything that's happened, right? Because you have to know all the rules before you start re-engineering, breaking, bending, whatever. Otherwise, yes, you have no context. You have no context, yeah, and your practice is completely unfounded.
Yes, exactly. And also, ultimately, every work you undertake and every endeavor you undertake, every artistic initiative you embark on is somewhere in response to or reaction to, yes, something that's already there or that has come before. It's always a dialogical practice.
Yes.
It's very, very rare that you sit in isolation in a vacuum and you do not react to something or think about something you have perceived or encountered or read. So ultimately, every piece of progress is, by definition, cumulative, yes, and dialogical as well.
That's a new word for me. What does it mean?
You create and you think new thoughts, or you create a new artwork through an inner dialogue that you are holding with what you experience around you and what you react to around you, right? So obviously, if we go back to Khwarazmi, if he had an inquisitive mind, which of course most certainly was also to a large part driven by his desire to understand the universe that God had created and to which he was submitting as a Muslim with everything that brings with it, he would obviously have wanted to learn and to read. He would have then come across what was available at his time for reading, and he would then have reacted to it either by saying, this is amazing, I want to know more, or he would have said, I don't agree with that, I need to actually find out whether this is true, I have a different sense, let me experiment here, let me explore there.
Yes.
So it is in dialogue with your ideas, perceptions, vibrations, that external vibrations of whatever kind, that actually drive you forward.
I think that's really profound, and I concur completely with that sentiment. And it's interesting that Isaac Newton said famously that the only reason I can see anything beyond is because I stand on the shoulders of giants, to acknowledge all the people that came before. Right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And
right?
the tragedy is that in those kind of statements that are celebrated around the world now, the acknowledgement that those shoulders that he's standing on are shoulders from across the world, not only from the West.
That's right. Well, Western Enlightenment, sorry to interrupt you. I care deeply about this, Dr. Al-Khamis, and famously, I think it was said in the Oxford Union Chamber by Mehdi Hassan that the Western Enlightenment could not have happened without the Golden Age of Islam, and I believe that is indeed correct.
Yes, of course. And if you have someone like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, he would not have been able to develop his use of perspective in painting without having had the knowledge of scientific writings by scholars like Ibn al-Haytham.
You read my mind. I was going to literally bring him up next.
Yeah, and Ibn al-Haytham again was somebody who started off in Basra in southern Iraq, then relocated to Egypt, and
didn't he famously claim to be able to build a dam, and then went to the Fatimid Caliph and was in his employee for a while?
Yes, and then he ran into trouble because his dam calculations didn't work out 100%.
They were damned.
They were damned, exactly. But you see, there is so much interconnectivity between the scholarship and intellectual endeavors of different cultures that is not unique to the Muslim world, that can be observed wherever you go in the world. But the problem is the narrative that has emerged, which is a rather one-track narrative, and which no longer allows scope for the narratives that contribute to the master narrative from other cultures across the world. And of course, when we look at the Muslim world, what we also must acknowledge is that there were many different religious, ethnic, linguistic, cultural groups that contributed to that endeavor. Jewish communities, Christian communities, many
Indian,
Buddhists,
all of them.
And whether you look at the sciences or you look at the arts, there was an interconnectivity across many, many different disciplines. And in our globalized, interconnected world, it would actually be good for all of us to recover those strands and to tell those alternative narratives to add to the substance of our understanding of where we are as a humanity today.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I love that you use that kind of language, because I think all of human existence is this giant tapestry. And when we start to lose sight of the threads that actually were on the loom, and are on the loom, I think we get a much less rich tapestry. And it's interesting because Sanskrit, for example, contains so much wisdom, like the Vedas, the Upanishads specifically, say so many things that today quantum physics is just beginning to touch on. Ideas about non-locality, about spooky action, so on and so forth. And so it's fascinating to me that the ancients and just humans in general have held so much knowledge that today we just either willingly neglect or actively choose to suppress. And I think the fact that the Aga Khan Museum is trying to reopen those doors, to reframe that perspective, to make the contributions of Islam, but also world culture, because I feel that the Aga Khan Museum, although it is a Muslim museum, it's actually, like the Beit al-Hikmah, a patron of all great scholarship and all great artists and all great thinking. And
Yes, and I would perhaps kind of rephrase the positioning slightly, because we
okay,
are not a Muslim museum, because that implies we are a religious museum, which we are
no, you're
not.
secular. I totally
Uh,
understand that. I
What I would
totally,
say
yeah,
is,
yeah.
what I would say is that the Al-Khan Museum was given as a gift to Canada in recognition of Canada's and Toronto's uh, exemplary aspirations
As a
towards
pluralist nation.
pluralism and positive multicultural societies. And
Hmm, hmm.
the patron may be a Muslim and maybe the spiritual leader of a particular Muslim community, but the museum is given as a catalyst for dialogue among different cultures, different groups, a sanctuary for all, where everyone is welcome, where we are exploring not only what the contributions of Muslim civilizations in all their diversity, and of course absolutely embracing non-Muslim cultures, but also very much the interconnectivity between all of us and the interconnectedness around themes that we are all concerned about and we all care about in this day and age. And in that context, the collection of Islamic art is also understood to really be a catalyst for conversation and a launch pad for storytelling that still has an immediate relevance to all of us today.
Thank you for reframing that. That was so eloquent and beautiful, and I recognize that fact on a very deep level. And I'm really glad that you said it to the way you did, because I think the people that listen to this will have a beautiful way to now understand what the institution is and what it represents. The fact that it's secular, that it's non-denominational, and that it's inherently an inclusive and dialogue-driven space.
Yeah.
Even the architecture, I would say, the fact that the museum is built by a Japanese master, the gardens obviously a Lebanese master, and then on the other end the Ismaili Center by an Indian. I think that also shows that the whole project is a kind of dialogue about pluralism, about the cosmopolitan ethic in action and enacted. So I think it's beautiful that is the case, and that that the mandate of the museum encompasses all of human civilization. I think this is very poignant.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it really is
Das ist
a
sehr gut.
thank you. That it is a project that shows us, or that allows us to explore the infinite potential of people coming together and exploring their shared humanity across differences and specificities. And I always think that particularly here in Toronto, it never takes more than 1 minute to have a connection with somebody else, even though we might come from completely different backgrounds. And when you realize that, and you realize that human connection doesn't take more than opening a conversation, then you really sometimes wonder why not more people just start that conversation and have that inquisitive mindset, that curious mindset of discovering more, of learning more about other fellow human beings that these scholars and scientists we were just talking about earlier had and carried with them throughout their lives. Because every human encounter is enriching.
Indeed.
As a principle. And the more you open yourself up to the willingness to just say hello and ask a question, the more the potential to grow as a human being and to learn more, to understand more, and to understand better is maximized.
That's so beautifully put. That's so beautifully put. And when I was, and this is completely off topic about the Aga Khan Museum, but on this topic of world culture and learning from every encounter, when I was in Berlin and I got to play some pipe organs and carillons and instruments that come from this deep kind of German classical music tradition, I actually felt it helped me understand Muslim music and Muslim chanting that much more. Like when you listen to a bell, you realize that the fundamental tone is actually the result of all these other partials. Well, it's the same thing with the human voice. And when somebody recites the Quran or calls the azan, the reason it can carry so powerfully is because, like the bell, all these other partials are being leveraged to create this beautiful fundamental tone.
Yes, and ultimately, you know, music came out of the desire to commune with the divine.
Indeed.
Where the roots lie. And now, of course, again, we separate into secular and religious.
Yes.
But
the false dichotomy, as His Highness put it.
Yeah, and this is something that never existed before perhaps the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when church and state were separated, and then, you know, I think therefore I am principle came to the fore. But ultimately, even if we no longer in some quarters acknowledge our search ultimately for the divine or for the greater truth in the universe, we are still always searching. We are still always searching for something that we don't understand, that we want to learn, that we want to perceive better. And this pull is an eternal pull. It is not something that ever will find ultimate satisfaction. You know, again, coming back to the principle of
because creation is creationary. That's the irony of it.
Yeah, and it is also something that no progress without searching, you see. So it is, I think, at the very heart of the human condition to keep searching, whatever that may be, from the essential and existential to the aspirational and eternal.
Yes.
But the searching is always an instinct that drives us forward and that drives the world forward, for better or for worse.
Very true, very true. Well, as a metaphysical logician, I think you'll love my my mottos. One is creo ergo sum, which means I create or believe, therefore I am, instead of I think, therefore I am. I hope I'm not putting Descartes in front of the horse with that one. And then conseque singulatatem, which means become singular.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, become singular is also a fallacy, because no individual human being or life form can actually exist in this creation in isolation.
True. But when I say become singular, I think the context, the centering of that motto is that in what you do, like let's say when you're composing a piece of music, become singular in that context to render the essence of whatever that happens to be. Because I think Allah, God, is the essence of God is singular. And so to tap into that, which uniquely people who choose to do so are able, usually artists, scholars, whatever. So it's kind of a call to action, if you will. So it's saying, seek that singularity. Don't shy away from it, let's say. So it's like a Sufi idea or of marifat, you know, that when you meditate, or for example, when Prophet Muhammad attained enlightenment through his Miraj, you know, in meeting God, maybe the perception is that he no longer exists. His ego is no longer there. It's only God. So that's the concept of the motto, become singular. Fana fila, essentially, is the real esoteric meaning of the motto.
Yes. But then again, human perception by definition is limited, and only this, not even the sum of human perceptions will ever get you close to the eternal truth. So that's again where the searching has to continue ad infinitum.
Infinitely, yes. But isn't that beautiful when you think about it, that you can never know anything?
Absolutely. You know? That's the exciting potential of being alive, you know, because if you knew everything, what's the point of living? Quite.
Well, Dr. Al-Khamis, I have been very moved and very touched by this conversation, and I wish to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me on this little adventure.
I'm grateful that you asked me. Thank you so very much, Afraz, and all the very best with your creative endeavors and with your podcast.
Thank you very much. Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum assalam.